We've concluded executive session, during which time we discussed the litigation and some other legal advice. Is there anything else we need to do with respect to that? Okay. So I think we should proceed with the rest of our meeting. And we certainly appreciate the public's patience while we try to take care of that. Thank you for being here. And I think we were going to start with a discussion about contribution levels.
Yep. If I could. Thank you, Mylan. I'd like to move on two fronts. There's been, a sense that we have these two different contribution levels for participants and non-participants. And one of the objections to that, I think, and one goes against the overall intent of the legislation, and that is to encourage people to participate. So in thinking about it, the difficulty we have, of course, is that you cannot make it so limiting if you don't participate on the one hand, and on the other hand, we want to make it equal. So the recommendation that I'm putting forward is to make the statewide office down from $69,000 down to $25,000, both for participants and non-participants. State Senate to $10,000, State Assembly $6,000, half for the primary, half for the general. So if you only have a primary, for instance, you'd only get the half that is associated with that in terms of the contribution level. And then at the same time, as I say, that it be the same for participants and non-participants, realizing that the first $250 of a participant's donation is going to be matched by the match that far exceeds the 6-to-1 that they've been speaking about. So that is the, this was originally from the governor's bill, which did pass the Assembly and was presented in the Senate prior to the change in the majority, so it never passed the Senate. But that is something that these numbers have already come off of a legislative bill, and I recommend we stick with that, though we make it both for participants and non-participants.
I would just comment.
Sensitive today.
Sorry, my tight space.
Here.
Henry, if you call. With respect to creating parity between participating and non-participating on the contribution side, I certainly agree it would help with incentivizing candidates to participate, but I don't think that is the sole objective of what we're doing. We're trying to change behavior, and if a candidate is not giving anything up in exchange for the tax dollars that they're drawing down, I just don't think that it's producing the one, taxpayer justification, but also the change in behavior for the candidate that's participating. If my contribution limit's the same, it's obviously going to give me the ability to not only draw down the dollars, but benefit from the higher contribution limit that's equalized with the non-participating candidate, if there is one. I also worry about the voluntary nature of the program if there is essentially now no incentive not to participate, and what that does to the cost. So I think there should be a differential, and because it was raised here, and I don't think we've ever settled it, even though some of the conversations have alluded to us taking some sort of consensus vote or opinion with respect to equalizing the amount or the contribution limits in the primary and the general. I think there should be a differential there too. It's a smaller field. It's less voters that you're speaking to. I don't see a justification for having the same amount in both the primary and the general.
So just to go in a little bit of a different direction, I would just say, honestly, looking at the limits that are being proposed from your recommendations, Jay, the contribution limits are still grossly too high, in my opinion. I think to the extent, with all due respect to Assembly members, that we are going to say that they can raise even more than what someone would apply to federal office for a Assembly district, to me, is an exorbitant amount. As you probably saw, I recommended a substantially lower contribution level across all offices, so really would want to have that conversation and really think about how do we bring these limits down to more reasonable limits that are benchmarked against the city council, which I think is analogous to an assembly district. Have a Senate limit that is somewhere between a statewide limit and an assembly limit, right? So a little bit higher than that, and have the statewide limit match the federal limit. I'm especially concerned about contribution limits, and I'll talk about participating and non-participating separately, but I'm especially concerned about the high level of contribution limits in this contest if we're not going to allow out-of-district matches, because it really is not driving towards the goal of lowering or eliminating the influence of certain folks in the system, and I think we really should be incentivizing people to give it a more reasonable level. I don't think this goes far enough in bringing down what we know are the exorbitantly high limits we have in New York. I feel comfortable with having similar limits for participating and non-participating candidates. That has been done in the city and in other districts in the past, but I am especially concerned about how high these contribution limits are and would encourage us to go further to reduce them going forward.
I'm concerned about the level of the contribution limits. I do not believe that the federal contribution limits present a viable comparison. The presidential system has totally fallen apart based on on those limits. The federal system also gives people a contribution limit for a contest or a convention, whether it's contested and whether people participate or not. So that it's really $8,400 a person in many, many cases, and not $2,800 a person. So I don't think that's the comparison, but I think these levels are too high. And I think our statute leads us in a much different direction. We had discussed this previously and had come up with a bifurcated participating, non-participating system. And those levels were certainly a lot more reasonable, I think, than what we're dealing with here. And I think we ought to look to those to guidance. In terms of the difference between a primary and a general, a television spot costs the same in a primary as it does in a general, no matter how many people you reach out to. Some mailing costs are different, but there's less mailing, more television. Social media is essentially the same. So I don't think we need a difference between primary and general, but I think going to 25,000, I think 25,000 is where the law started on statewide elections before it was indexed up all these years, and I think we also have to, think about indexing. I note that the city has not put in indexing, and when they need adjustments, they make specific adjustments. But I would be much more comfortable looking at what we discussed earlier, which was for statewide between 12,000 and 16,000 participating, non-participating. And Senate and Assembly are not dissimilar here, but I think we ought to look at those. And I'd ask that we discuss and consider each one of them separately.
Yeah, just to add to those comments, I think there are two issues. One, do we have the same limits for participating and non-participating? And I think the answer to that, from my perspective, is if we want to get big money out of politics, if we want to change behavior and incentivize people to participate, we ought to have them be equal contribution limits for participants and non-participants. I think that's really important. And I understand what you said, David, but we do want to change behavior, and this will incentivize people to participate. As to the contribution limits, I agree with Henry and Denora. They should be lower, and we should look at what's been previously proposed as guidelines. So the Brennan Center originally had for state 12 for participating and 16 for non, 8 for the Senate for participating and non-participating, 12 for participating, 8 for non-participating. Back up, I'm getting confused. 8 for participating and 12 for non-participating. And for Assembly, 4 for participating and 7 for non-participating. I think we should, look at a number in between, closer to the participating number, like 8 for the Senate and 4 for the Assembly, and that's close to what Denora has proposed in her bifurcated system. That's kind of the average, I think, Denora, in yours.
It isn't the average of what you just said.
No,
No.
I'm looking at 12, 8, and 4. And Denora's was 5,600 for participating and 7,100 for non-participating for the state.
Yeah.
4,200 for participating for Senate, 6,500 for non-participating, 2,850 for participating for the Assembly, and 5,150 for non-participating. So one way to go is to take Denora's non-participating numbers, which are 7,061 and 51, which are considerably lower than the current proposal, and even lower than the Brennan proposal. So that's one way to go.
Is
But we
that,
have to lower those limits.
is that an accurate reflection of the Brennan numbers? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, and thank you. And since Commissioner Nona cited the Brennan Center's work, I just wanted to amend where we're at. The previous contribution limits that we had recommended were in a world where the commission was discussing the 6-to-1 statewide match, and now that we're talking about in-district only for legislative contests, we wanted to express that we fully support much lower limits because of the reasons that Commissioner Gatacho laid out. And our previous numbers were the highest possible limits that we thought were reasonable, and they were based really in a context coming out of the governor's previous bill from the last session. And so the Brennan Center would very much support much lower limits along Commissioner Gatacho.
Rather than the 12, 16, 8, 12, 4, 7.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah, everything we do is balancing. And one of the things that has been mentioned, and we have to consider it, is that the only money in campaigns is not the money that's contributed to candidates. There's outside money coming in, independent expenditures, and a candidate who's participating in the program or not participating in the program has to be able to raise enough money to be responsive to outside money. We can't have it that the only voice that can't be heard in a campaign is the candidate's voice. And while I believe that the numbers that Commissioner Jacobs proposed are too high, by the same token, I think that these numbers are too low. And I think there's a middle ground where there's a significant reduction, but candidates aren't precluded from having their voices heard. And I think if we discuss each one, I think, as I said, 25,000 is too high, 7,000 is too low. We were discussing earlier between 12 and 16. I think between 12 and 16 is a reasonable number for a statewide race, balancing all the competing interests. And similarly, I think a number between 8 and 12 is reasonable for Senate, and between 4 and 6 is reasonable for the Assembly, balancing all of these other things. I know some people will be upset it's too high, but we have to deal with the reality of what's happened to campaigns today, and candidates have to be able to effectively campaign if this is going to be an effective system.
I'm just trying to get us to some consensus. We're going to break this down. My recommendation would be to break this down to two things. One, we're going to take, as you said, Henry, each of these numbers, these contribution levels individually, so we'll do that. And then the other issue would be evening it up for participating and non-participating. That's the two parts of this discussion. So what I'd like to suggest is, first of all, on the state Senate number, I'm hearing, and Henry, if I hear what you said, and not far off from what you said, John, somewhere between 8 and 12. 12 was what non-participating was. 8 was what participating was. Well, 10,000 is the recommendation. That is between 8 and 12. And then if you take the state assembly, you had between 4 and 7, and I pushed it to 8 and made between 4 and 7, 6. And so if you felt more comfortable, I could probably live with 5. So if state senate could be 10 and state assembly could be 5, I think we then have some kind of a compromise that seems to meet pretty close to where everybody, that would be, but then again, that is predicated on that being both for participant and non-participant. So what do the members feel about that?
Okay. I just want to,
I think you're on.
no one does. So I just want to just reiterate, setting them at the same level, I agree, they have to be set at the right level. They have to come down from where they are drastically. But if you set them at the same level, I don't see why an incumbent is not utilizing the exact same fundraising strategies as they do now in collecting the highest level that they can, as well as creating some, social media, direct mail, telemarketing outreach to draw down public dollars. They're not interacting at all. It doesn't hurt them if they don't necessarily, but why they aren't still reaching for that maximum dollar, where if you cause it to be different, they're giving up potentially a $5,000 contribution and limiting themselves only to a $2,500 contribution in exchange for the increased efforts at the small dollar donor. So I don't think you're changing anything. I think you're just creating the small dollar donor as a subsidy to normal fundraising activities that we see today, and that's not what it's meant to be. So I just strongly disagree with the parity concept. I agree that they have to come down. They can't come down so much that a candidate can't compete.
I want to try to get to some consensus and move things forward, and I think Commissioner Previtt has made his point. I think you've proposed a compromise. I think we're just going to have to decide at some point and vote, because I don't necessarily think that we have discussed these issues, and many people have expressed their viewpoints, and given the date, I think we should try to perhaps consider if there's some consensus where we can move forward with at least a majority.
May I make a motion on the first part of it, which is that we equalize the contribution limit between the primary and the general? Let's make that determination, and then we can decide what those numbers are.
Okay.
And I so
We're-
move.
Just so I'm clear, so because I'm a little bit concerned about, because these all have a kind of cascading or interlocking effect on each other, that we're going to take individual votes again on components of this program without talking about it in the totality. I feel much less comfortable talking about. I would like to hear us talk about the entirety of what we would like to see on the table and consider all of this at once, rather than piecemeal and not think about the consequences this might have on other things. I appreciate the applause, but it doesn't help me do my job up here. So respectfully, like, we're having a deliberative discussion, I want to respect that. So in my personal opinion, I would prefer, if we were going to continue to debate all of the issues on the table, and to have a conversation and about the entirety of the package rather than piecemeal, because it also, we're talking about it as if we're not designing a system in the totality that has to work, which is why I've been pushing on the contribution limits being substantially lower, because if we're not going to allow an out-of-district match, which is what we will talk about at some point during this conversation, this has a huge impact on that. So in my own personal recommendation is that we not continue to take individualized votes on a piecemeal proposal.
So are you suggesting we just
Debate.
ample time to discuss, move on to the next, and deal with it all?
And
Well, you-
if someone is keeping scribe, I don't
Really,
know.
you come back as one vote at the end.
No, we'll
So-
come back at each. We have to come
No,
back on.
I don't think,
That's not my recommendation is to come back and hear the entirety of the proposal, and then we can decide if that is where we're going from here, as opposed to like the one-off votes again.
I don't think that's gonna work.
It's not
I
gonna
mean, with
work.
all due respect to you, I think that there's so many components of this that we at least have to, as we did before, and then it changed.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. So I don't know why we'd be in a position to continue to have it change if we can have our staff take the
I
notes
agree
and tell
with
us
you.
what the entirety of the proposal
I mean, I
is.
thought we had agreed on these limits, and now today they're different than they were at the last meeting.
Yep.
So,
Denora, can I make the suggestion? It-
Yeah.
It might be helpful. Let's move forward and have a vote yes or vote no on it. And then, after we have gone through all of the proposals, let's allow any member to bring us back to something that was decided that doesn't comport with the rest of the proposals in that member's view. How's that?
I don't think I have a choice, but you've heard my views.
Well, you certainly have a
That's the
choice.
reality.
That's why I'm asking.
No,
Just to be clear, we're moving forward on a vote on two things then.
One thing at a time.
One thing, I mean, but we're going to, with
Yes.
respect to contribution limits, we're gonna be talking about whether or not we are making the participating and non-participating equal.
That's the only
That's-
thing that's on the table.
That's the only thing on the table at the moment.
No, Henry proposed something about primary in general.
That they be
First
equal.
said equal.
That they're, right, okay.
Wait, can you repeat it then?
mean
I
primary in
think,
general, you mean participating and non-participating. Okay, so,
E-
the motion on the table.
The motion is, I'm sorry, as corrected,
Yes.
thank you, is to equalize between the participant and the non-participating candidates.
So we had some discussion, is there any further discussion?
It's been seconded, so it's for vote. So all in favor of equalizing between participant and non-participant, say aye.
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 Someone counting those votes?
Opposed? Just do the nays.
Nay.
nay.
Three. Three nays.
Yeah, 6-3.
Me.
It was Denora, Kimberly, and David.
6-3?
Yep. Okay. Next.
I move that the contribution limit for state assembly be $2,500 in the primary and $2,500 in the general.
So 5,000 total.
5,000 total.
I second
Okay, all in favor?
I'm sorry, before we vote,
Mhm.
2,500 each? From which proposal are you going from?
That's
Is
not
this
on
the
any
other
of
It's
two?
not a proposal, we're lowering
It's-
this one.
I
It's
think we discussed it.
lower than Jay's,
Higher than.
higher than Denora's.
The middle.
And, you know, and the understanding is also, if you don't have a contested primary, or you don't get it, right? I
What
mean,
happens if you have two contested primaries? You get two limits?
you only get one.
That's not the way it currently works.
It's the way it works in the city system, and it works.
Oh,
We can get to that later, that's not the
Okay.
issue.
Yeah.
All right.
All right? So it's 5,000 split evenly between primary and general.
25, just so we're all clear, 2,500 and 2,500.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, Jay, did you second that?
Yeah.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Any opposed?
Yep, three, 6-3. Denora and Commissioner President Galvin, okay.
I move for the state senate.
Can I, before you make the motion, just so I can opine, because I didn't opine on this, similar to other arguments where there's consistency between the offices, I don't know what's being proposed here, but if you're starting at 5 for assembly, if the Senate is 2.4 times the size of it, similarly, some sort of rational basis for where you're setting these limits, if you're starting at the assembly at 5,000, is my only point before you throw a number out there.
Yeah. It is 2.4, but being twice as high isn't out of the range, and that's why I am moving that we have a contribution limit for state senate of $5,000 in the primary and $5,000 in the general.
Second.
Okay, Jay, second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Nay.
Nay.
So, oh wait, I didn't do the opposed, hold on.
I'm nay on this one.
You're a nay, so that is 5-4.
And just for purposes of clarity of the record, I'm voting no because I agreed to the other thresholds that we did at the last meeting, which I think were more adequate and more fully discussed.
Okay, next.
And I voted no because I think the Senate should be more in the range of 7,000 or 8,000 rather than 10,000.
Okay.
And I'll take the liberty of saying I voted no because they are all generally too high and would much rather have a discussion about the proposal I put on the table to reduce the limit substantially, especially if we're going to have a contribution limit discussion where we're not going to allow for matching contributions outside of the district.
Okay, let's keep going.
Yeah, I move that for statewide offices, the contribution limit be $15,000 divided 7,500 in the primary and 7,500 in the general. And I think that's going to require, I'm throwing this out, I think this requires more discussion. We were at 12 and 16 before, you know, and I'm putting it in the middle, but closer to the non-participant rate from where we were before. And once again, it's that balancing. So, but I think this requires further discussion and not just a vote.
I agree.
So who wants to say something?
I'd like to table this for further discussion. I move to table for further discussion.
I think we should discuss it now.
Right.
too.
What do
When we
when
discuss
else
it.
would we discuss it?
Yeah, we should discuss it now.
Why is this any different than the other contribution limits?
Well, because the difference here is, if you look at proportionality, there's absolutely no proportionality in that number between the gubernatorial that's going to be at $10,000 and a statewide, 62 counties across the state of New York, that's going to be at $15,000. So that, and when you're looking at the amount of money that it costs to run a campaign, going with what Henry stated, and I agree with, that the voice of the candidates is very important, and you do have independent expenditures and the like. If we are equalizing these numbers, then I would say to you that it has to be much higher.
Just for the point of the record, though, it is higher than what we agreed to the last meeting. We agreed that the participating candidates would be 12,000 and the non-participating would be 16,000. So I think Commissioner Berger, to his credit, did increase that when he recommended the 15,000 in accordance with the other proposals that he made earlier. So I say we move for a vote.
Again, I am saying I think we need to table this. It doesn't go in accord with what the Assembly has passed. I think that we have to have a little bit more reasoned look at it. I understand on the local level, that we are very close to what the State Assembly passed and very close to what the State Senate passed. We're off by $1,000 on the Assembly, but everything else, $500 in the primary, $500 in the general, everything else is exactly in line with the bill that the legislature, that did give us the authority to do our job, but has given guidance in the sense of passing a bill already, has put. And I'd like to stick with and support what the Assembly has passed previously. I think that's important. And this is, I think that the $15,000 amount, well-intentioned though it is way too low.
Big money
And-
out, voters in! Those contributions are too high! Big money out, voters in! Big money out,
They're gonna have to, there's nothing we can do.
big money out, voters in! 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 Big money out, voters in!
Public finance 6-1, all state, not just
Contributions are too high. Flowers. Flowers that are taken. Yes. Come.
Keep it going though.
big money out, voters in.
Big money out. Voters in. Big money out. Voters in. Big money out. Voters in. Big money out. Voters in. Big money out. Voters in. Big money out. Voters in. Big money
They're leaving, let's just let them go.
Shut it down.
If we don't get it,
Shut it down.
don't touch it. Don't touch it. Not touching anybody.
Was that in support of Jay's motion to table, or I don't know what that,
I guess we should decide whether we're going to table it or not.
I think we should just vote on it.
I think we.
Agreed.
Wait, why do you want to table it, Jay?
I'd like to table it
I
for
would like to
further.
understand why.
Okay, because I think that there are legitimate questions. I think that a lot of things, to Nora's point earlier, I think there are certain things we can deal with, but when there is controversy, I think we have to.
What's the controversy?
The controversy is, I think that this is way too low.
What number are you?
I would go with what the Assembly passed, I think multiple times, frankly, and what the governor's bill, which is 25,000. That is what the Assembly passed. And I would like to go with what the Assembly has done. Again, I am of the belief that the minority in the Senate at the time was in support of the same bill, they just couldn't pass it.
Well,
And
if
that's
you
why-
remember, at the first meeting, I said we should use those bills, and everybody told me no, that we were gonna go our own way.
Okay.
So secondarily, if the only debate on the issue is that Jay disagrees with it, I think we should move for the vote.
I think we should support what the Assembly has previously done. I just think that makes sense for the reasons that Commissioner Jacobs has said, and keep going. So,
So let's vote.
Well,
So a
I think-
25,000, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think you have to deal with the motion to table, and then you have a motion.
do you want to move to table? Then
Since Jay has a lot of questions, how are you gonna resolve your, if it gets tabled, right? What are you trying to reach with the table? Like, between now and then, what is the difference?
Well, and when's
I just
then?
wanna know, yeah,
And when is then?
well,
And are we having more discussion
I
about
think
it?
we, yes, I think we should have more discussion about
Let's
it.
have it now.
I think that, well, again, I think that we should have a good amount of discussion about it and think about it, come up with a number, not just throw a number in that's got no relevance to anything that's been out there before that legislative bodies have put
So
forward.
what additional information would we need? Because we have experts here who've done the research, so if there's something that we need guidance or facts on, we can, I'm sure, ask Professor Malbin, the Brennan Center, reInvent others.
This
What
is-
else do we need in order to
Denora,
inform us on
This
this?
isn't an open hearing. This is a conversation.
No, I
amongst
understand. I'm
ourselves.
trying to understand, how do we inform ourselves? That's my question.
We have spent hours and days discussing numbers. At the last hearing, we had a consensus that the governor would be 12 participating, 16 out. Last night, we get 25,000 and they're the same amount. So we have discussed this over and over and over again and reached consensus. I mean, I think this doesn't prevent someone from just changing their mind tomorrow and issuing another directive that we all have to deal with. But I think we've done the other offices, let's just vote it.
well, I still wanna hear my answer.
I'm sorry, the
answered.
question?
What will be the difference between now and then?
I think that there would be more conversation that would be had and more review of what the Assembly had. I'd like to see what the Assembly's rationale was for picking that number. I don't have that information right now. I'd like to get that information and then maybe be able to present it to you.
So I think, I mean, this might be a question that the public would have, but isn't it the Assembly that voted on the other offices as well? So we were willing to go against the Assembly in terms of whatever their rationale was for the limits for Senate and Assembly, but now we're not, or we just want to discuss more, and I just want to understand. We just want to discuss more their rationale with respect only to the statewide office limit.
Well, in Jay's defense, what we voted on, the last two ones, are relatively close.
That's close to exactly what the Assembly had.
Yeah. The
That's why I'm
difference
saying
is
that,
10 grand.
you know, we accepted that.
And I
I
just
think-
wanted to
and I think we
understand,
should
so we
accept the
accepted
whole-
what the Assembly
Yeah, I
said
would
with
like-
respect to those offices,
That's
and
right.
you're asking that we have further discussion to accept what the Assembly says with
Exactly,
respect to
and I
statewide
need that
office.
information as to why they picked that number, all right? And when you accept the number, you know, or a very close number for the Senate and Assembly, I don't need further explanation. But when we are not going to accept it potentially, I believe there is a need for further information.
So you're gonna
I'd like
ask
to-
the people that punted this to us what their reason was for a bill that they couldn't pass?
They passed the bill.
You know, Commissioner Galvin, I recognize you're suing the commission, but, and
Yeah, just
perhaps,
so you
no,
know-
don't, you,
No.
and you don't think it should exist, but I don't think that, let's keep, the
I'm just
legislature did vote to have us
Misunderstood.
issue recommendations.
For the first time,
and
one of
we're
the
going to-
commissioners said they had to go back and check with the House of the legislature. Do you think these people missed that?
I don't think that's the first time, and I don't think the people miss anything, and I'm not trying to be condescending to anyone, so I don't appreciate
And
that.
I am
I'm
suing the
just-
commission because I believe it's an unconstitutional delegation to 9 unelected people. not
One of
because
which
I'm
is
not
you
trying-
who's voting.
All right, let's, yeah,
I agree wholeheartedly.
Commissioner Galvin, let me just say this, look.
Should we take a
I am,
5-minute recess?
no,
No.
I believe that I am just looking for the rationale on the bill that was passed. I'm not looking to ask anyone in the assembly what their view is. There is a bill. It was passed. It was passed with certain numbers. I want to take a look at what the rationale was for those numbers
Oh.
and present it. That's all I'm looking to do. So I'm just asking, I made a motion to table. It's on
We
that
should vote on
basis.
the motion.
I'm asking if there's a second, and then we can move.
Vote on the motion to table.
So who's in favor of table?
Well, first we need a second. So, I'll-
Second it so we can vote on it.
great, thank you. All in favor?
Tabling.
To table it.
Yep.
Yeah, aye.
Aye.
Table it to what day?
Well, that doesn't.
That really depends.
Until it's removed from the table.
So is that 3 in favor? I don't, I'm sorry. Maybe we'll do the nay.
Do a roll call, I guess, on that.
So, okay, we'll just go around. It'll be quick.
This is the motion to table? Nay.
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 Aye.
Aye.
Nay.
Nay.
Aye.
I'm just a little disoriented because I just want to know till when will be the table, but I will go for aye.
What is that?
So it's 1, 5, 4.
We lost. Okay, it's not tabled.
5-4 not table.
Not tabled.
The vote was 5-4, just for the audience to not table.
So now Henry's motion is for the statewide limit to be 15,000 for participating and non-participating.
Needs a second.
Look, and look, Jay's proposed 25. There are other numbers out there. I put out one to start the discussion. We've started the discussion. I think we need further. If people don't like 15 or they don't like 25, I would hope they would speak up and suggest a number that they think is workable, and maybe out of this, we will ultimately reach some consensus. But so far, Jay and I have expressed 2 opinions. There are 7 others of you I would hope to hear from, from you.
Just from a technical standpoint, I think there was a motion made. I think there's got to be a call for a second on your numbers. It wasn't out there as a discussion. That's why I think he was tabling. So just from a parliamentarian standpoint, whether or not.
I thought there
we-
was a second, and now it's open for discussion.
It's open for discussion, but we're going to have to, it's something that
second
we're,
it.
it's, okay.
Yeah, and in terms of discussion, I'm hoping part of the discussion is people will say, I feel more comfortable with some other number.
I just want to clarify, what we're doing now, it's not permanent votes. These are just consensus votes, is it?
Preliminary votes.
Preliminary votes just for us to move on, then we'll revisit this on the last meeting?
Well, we have to revisit
Or-
the whole.
The whole, okay, just to make sure.
Well, I'll throw out, I think we should go with the lower number for participating candidates that the Brennan Center originally put forward, which was 12,000, rather than 15.
Come on, commissioners, don't be shy. You've got thoughts on this. We've been working on this for a couple months now. I mean, there have to be some other thoughts.
Well, I would agree. Originally, I thought we had agreed on the 12,000, but I understand Commissioner Jacobs' rationale. I know where you get the 15,000. It is a statewide race. It is an expensive state. So I'm inclined to support Henry's motion at this time and move away from the 12,000 that we had talked about last time.
I'm happy to reiterate for the record, my push for lower contribution limits below the 7,500, so 5,600 for participating and 7,100 for non-participating.
But what would you recommend if we had the same limit for participating and non-participating?
It's a good question. I think it's below the 7,500. So even at a maximum, I'm going to go with the 7,100 that I proposed for non-participating candidates.
For both
For both.
participating and non?
I mean, but yes, I don't support that, but yes, I would prefer there be different limits for participating and non-participating, but I still think it has to be lower.
I'm going to be a no on any contribution that has the same for participating, non-participating. I certainly would be open to a 25 for a non-participating if the participating was set at 12 or 15. But if you're going to combine the two, then I think I'd be a no on it. And you have to factor in, if we were at participating at 12,000, it's 12,000 plus the taxpayer subsidy. So it's fine being low there, but now you're forcing the non-participating in as well without that subsidy. So I'm fine with a higher, but you can't do that if we're treating them all the same. So I'll be a no on either a 12 or a 15.
I just want to make clear, I do not view campaign finance as taxpayer subsidies. I think that it is like many things our government does to try to incentivize and help people. I don't think that our paying for public schools is a subsidy. I just would not describe it that way. So I just don't think that that's how I would characterize public financing.
So where are we? Henry's motion
We
at
have to
15?
vote on it, yeah.
I seconded it, we discussed it. So, a vote on Henry's motion?
Okay, so I think we probably need to do a roll call on this as well. We want to start on that side?
Yes. I vote no.
I vote no. I vote no.
I vote yes.
I vote no.
I vote no.
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 Yes.
So 2 yeses, the rest noes, motion fails.
Another motion.
No, I would actually, this may get shot down, but I'll go for it. I think we should try to just move on to the next topic. Since we had a motion that didn't carry and resolve this.
We'll revisit.
I mean,
So it ultimately ends up getting tabled.
we're between 25 and
15.
and 15
No, we're between
essentially.
25 and 7,100.
That's right.
Yes.
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 So, I'd hate to leave this open this late in the game. Make a motion for 20. 10 and 10 for statewide offices.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Discussion? Anybody want to say anything? Okay, I think we'll go back.
The question.
Sorry. Did you want to say something, Commissioner?
No, I just
Romano?
moved the question, which
Okay.
means let's vote.
You're next, John.
No. Okay, so,
Me?
Yes.
No. If you want my vote, no, on that motion.
so wait, we didn't call for vote, so yes, you want to start?
No.
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 Okay. So, again, I would
I
suggest,
hear you.
Just trying to get parameters where people are at.
Now we're 50. Well, they're too,
Let's go
they're
to-
saying it's too low, and we're saying it's too high. So, there's no parameters.
Can I make,
either.
can I, as a motion order, what I'd like to do is move to allow candidates having raised matchable contributions who do not have a competitive race and thus either do not qualify or choose not to take matchable funds, to choose to retain those contributions and roll them forward to the next election. This is the same rule that applies in the New York City program. And the rationale is that it allows candidates to retain funds as they would under normal circumstances, but not have to give the money back to the donor who gave $75 or $200, and then when an election comes that is contested, have to go back to the donor and ask the donor again.
So
The
ju-
city does this.
Just a point of clarification, because I'm not really all that hip on the city program. So I've been an incumbent for 10 years. I have no race. I'm in the program. I raise threshold amount and I raise the number of matchable things amount. So because I don't have a contested election moving into the next one, I don't have any work to do. I'm already set.
Yeah, you didn't take matchable dollars, you didn't
Right.
take the money, but you did raise it, and you'd be already.
So in the next cycle, I have nothing to do while the challenger has the entire threshold and number of matches to make? I'm just
So
clarifying.
those- your previous qualification carries forward to
That's
the
right.
next election.
That's right.
Just to be clear, under the city program, you can transfer money from a prior account into your current account. It doesn't count towards threshold, it's not matchable.
Okay.
It's just a transfer of the funds that are available to
So you can use those funds, but you still have to qualify in that next election.
If you want to participate in the program, you have to
Okay, you see that.
qualify, and none of that money is matchable.
Is the money that you're transferring the money that you raised minus the match for those dollars?
You shouldn't have gotten any match for those dollars. if
I
you-
qualify in the primary.
Right.
I raise, say, the maximum amount. I spend half of it, right? Does the remaining half get transferred after match?
There's no match.
Or without? What, I'm
You
in
have
a,
no- You have no opponent.
David.
no, I have a,
David, if in a prior race you participated in the program and you've gotten matching funds and you have money left over, you have to return it to the campaign finance board or whatever the entity is, up to the amount they've given you. You don't get to keep any matching funds.
That's what I'm
So the
asking.
only thing you're transferring is what you've actually raised.
And this says, the motion says, matchable contributions who do not have a competitive race and thus either do not qualify or choose not to take matchable funds. Okay, so in other words, it's not for someone who's had a race. You know, this is under a circumstance where they've raised the money, right? Didn't have the race, didn't take the matchable funds, can they take it and just move it forward?
and you're only moving forward the matchable contribution. So if I received,
No. It's written in our
candidates
plan.
raised matchable contributions. So, I mean,
Mine.
I'm just trying to understand what we're talking about.
Eligible to have been matched, but they weren't.
So amounts that I raised that weren't matchable, I don't transfer those over to the next election, even though they're within the contribution limit.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to understand what we're talking
You
about.
do transfer them, you could use those funds, but they can't be counted toward the qualifying to get matching funds in the next election. You still have to go out and raise the qualifying amount and the number of contributions, right? Okay.
So what you're moving forward is just for qualification purposes.
No.
You're moving forward so that you have the money, you could use the money in your campaign, but you can't use it to qualify to get matching funds. You have
Right.
to go out and raise the proper amount and number of contributions.
It's like one big
to
donation
qualify.
to yourself.
And it's permissible types of contributions, so it's not even just like all the big money stuff that you try to transfer over. They're talking about like you would have qualified, but you decided you weren't gonna take the public money. All that, let's call it the good permissible money, will be able to transfer over. Doesn't help you qualify this next election, but you can use it.
And, one other thing, I think this is too narrow because a candidate can be in a competitive race and still have money left over. And 2 years later or 4 years later, they run again, and at least under the city system, they can transfer that. The other caveat that, I think people should understand is, let's say you run for statewide office, and you get a bunch of contributions, and at some point, the race is over, you have money left. You can only transfer on a last-in, last-out basis up to whatever the contribution limit is for the next office you run for. So if you run statewide and have some $20,000 contributions, and then you run for the Senate, you can only transfer over $5,000 of that last $20,000 contribution.
That's my point. So anything within the contribution limit is transferable regardless of participation or non-participation into your next election.
Right.
But it's not matchable and doesn't help you.
It's
meet
not
the
matchable and
thresholds.
it doesn't count towards threshold.
So really what we're saying is, I mean,
This is the war chest issue.
this is a war chest, and you really, to say, funds that you transfer, which obviously have to be within contribution limits, funds that you transfer are not matchable and don't count towards your qualifying. It's really going the other, to state it that way is a little more clear, right?
But the alternative, and what some have advocated, is that you never be able to transfer previously raised funds. You can only use funds raised in the cycle. That's what the dichotomy is.
Right.
Now, if it's going to be binary, you can either only use funds raised in the cycle, or you can use other funds with these limitations on them.
And New York City allows you to develop a war chest.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Emma?
Oh, I would just note, however, that New York City also has expenditure limits, which
Right.
can
this is, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is an open meeting, and I respectfully, I read everything.
But he
that you
called
say.
on them.
No, Henry called.
But Henry called on them.
That's my fault, Jay, I'm sorry.
I just, we can't have,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
otherwise,
My fault.
everybody has a right to have something to say.
I'll be good.
Henry picked her.
That was a helpful comment, though, because it kind of does limit and allow a candidate, a challenger to catch up, so, yeah, I'd have to be, well,
It doesn't
move
allow
if you're moving on.
challenger.
Yeah, that's,
Move the question.
Okay. But I want to make sure that, it's more than just a wording change, that it's not just non-competitive races or no race, it's money left over from previous
Why don't you
races.
amend the motion so that we, and then read it to your liking, and then we'll move it. So why don't you just give Henry a second to amend it? And then read it.
It's going to take some
Can I-
words.
So
but-
let's
Can
table
I-
it.
No, but basically.
Can I make a-
No, it will read, move to allow candidates having raised matchable contributions who have funds remaining from a prior election,
One second.
from a prior election, to choose to retain those contributions and roll them forward to the next election up to the maximum contribution for each contributor.
One second.
You-
Roll them forward to the next
Since we're
I mean, you have an issue with the motion because you still limited it to matchable and then up to the contribution limit. So it either has to be, you only can roll over matchable, which is amounts below 250, or any legally permissible moves forward. So up to the contribution limit for that office, moves
Move to
forward.
allow candidates having funds raised
Mylan, restroom break.
for a prior election
He's drafting.
to choose to retain those contributions and roll them over to the next election up to the contribution limit for each contributor so transferred. And people can wordsmith that a little in the statute or the recommendation that we make, but that's,
That's the concept. It's not the
Right.
matchable, it's anything within contribution limit,
Right.
rolls forward. I'll leave it there. I have a lot of other questions with respect to other things, but I'll just leave it there.
Should we say such amount will not be subject to qualifying for the
Yeah.
next election cycle? Something
Such-
like that.
such transferred funds are not matchable and do not count towards thresholds, qualification thresholds.
So can we read out the motion in its entirety so we can make adjustments?
I think Jay has it.
And Charles, are you capturing this also? Because it would be helpful, yeah, to make sure we have an accurate representation of
The
that.
spirit of it, he said.
We need the actual text of it. So like if we need to go slower to make sure that you capture
The
it.
actual text, read it slowly.
We're on video.
We need the actual text.
video.
You're asking me to read my notes on this.
Right. That's why I was
Thank you,
asking
Henry.
Charles.
I thank you very much for that. Move to allow candidates having funds raised for a previous election to choose to retain those contributions and roll them forward to the next election up to the contribution limit so transferred. Such transferred funds are not matchable. And do not apply to meeting the appropriate qualification thresholds. Do not apply to meeting
Can I ask one more clarifying question?
qualification thresholds. One
Sorry.
moment, yep.
Do they keep rolling?
Yeah.
You can keep on rolling.
So that's
What's
worded
the
wrong then, because it's raised in the previous election.
How about in a prior election?
Any prior election?
In any prior election. Well, candidates retain, it's retained, remaining from any prior election. All right, I'll write that.
Or a prior election.
So change it to any, I think. Okay? Okay.
Should we call to a question? Is there a,
I move that,
I'm sorry.
Who's in the bathroom?
But I think we're okay.
Okay.
It's Henry's motion, and you're seconding.
Yeah.
Wait, we think we're okay, what? We're not gonna wait for her to come
We need
back?
to wait for
Yeah,
her
let
to
her
come
come back.
I don't, we can just,
Why would we not wait for her? It's not like she's not here. She went to the restroom.
Yeah,
She'll be
I
back.
think we should wait.
All right, we can take the vote in the
Either that or nobody will ever go to the restroom.
that's true.
Or everybody will go to the
Trying to
restroom.
discourage people from going to the bathroom.
Just a comment respectfully to, I am not here to call on the audience and make it a public hearing, but if there is expert research and data that we can rely on to help inform what we're doing up here, that was the only reason I think Henry or I actually nodded to the people, certain people in the audience, because we were mentioning their research and their underlying data without making sure that we're doing that accurately. I don't want to rely on faulty data, so it's not to turn it into a public hearing, but respectfully, if they're here, I would rather hear it from their mouth rather than us convolute it or misconstrue it in a way that we're relying on the wrong assumptions.
And I wanted to do the same with the assembly, but the bill. But my point is, though, that I don't want to get this into an open discussion with experts, though I appreciate and have read everything they have sent. If there is a specific question that we are basing, someone bases some information on that is challengeable, that is not accurate, I agree with you. I don't think we should be working off an inaccurate quotation of an expert who happens to be sitting in front of us. I agree with you there.
So,
Yeah, we're just waiting for her to return. Can I make a suggestion? Well, I can't, I have to wait till the members.
I just meant for the vote. I mean, we can talk, can't we?
Yeah, you can certainly talk.
I feel uncomfortable sitting here not saying anything. She took her phone with her.
Yes.
No, I'm gonna go with her. In case she's on the phone, right outside the door.
Thank you, Tim.
And hopefully the officer's there, because she can't actually get between the two doors. Oh, there you go. Perfect timing. It's like she's psychic.
Sorry, I went to go get Kim's water. She said she was
She blames
fine.
me for everything.
Oh,
She specifically told me I sounded horrible. Kim, you see? You see this? Kim, that's the medication.
comrade in arms there.
So I think, for our commissioner's sake, we're gonna have to
Yeah,
reread the motion. Sorry,
You
that
gotta be
may be-
kidding.
Sorry, Jay.
I apologize, Jay.
Okay. Move to allow candidates having raised funds for a prior for a prior election to retain those funds from any prior election, to choose to retain those contributions from any prior election and roll them forward to the next election up to the contribution limit so transferred. Such transferred funds are not matchable and do not apply to meeting any qualifying thresholds. Right? Okay?
And they're
So that's
spending it on
moved.
anything,
Somebody
right?
seconded it? Okay, second. Only all in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
Nay, that's too quick for me. I have to look at it.
Oh.
Do you want a
Because
minute?
I know, that's why.
Do you want a minute?
Yeah, can you repeat it? Because it's not, I can't, I
know,
have
it's
to
fair.
make a very thoughtful inside a decision. I can't just say yay because everybody's going for it.
That's fair.
Okay. Can somebody tape this, please? Move to allow candidates having raised funds for a prior election to choose to retain those contributions from any prior election and roll them forward to the next election up to the contribution limit so transferred. Such transferred funds are not matchable and do not apply to meeting qualification thresholds.
Okay.
No pressure, just let us know.
Well, a no vote on it, I think, in the absence of the spending limit. This is a devastating provision for the program, and that in conjunction with having participating, non-participating with the same limit, I think it's really problematic.
I'm a no vote as well, just because I have no problem with incumbency or no problem with incumbents, but a 10-year incumbent that continues to roll and amass a war chest is virtually, and then enters in for the matchable when they have a viable opponent, it just seems inherently unfair to me, so I'm a no vote.
Yay.
Aye.
Aye.
No.
Okay.
Right, just to make it clear, there's no matching, right? So it doesn't go to any other qualifications. Is there, how many cycles back can you go? Is there, no? Okay. I wasn't sure if I was reading too much into it.
You want it.
Okay, and all right, Jay, you're gonna kill me one last time, Jay, one last time. And I promise you I'll have a decision right after your last read.
No worries.
I don't draft bills, I really.
Right, and I don't do much killing. Move to allow candidates having raised funds to choose to retain those funds, having raised funds for a prior election, to choose to retain those funds from any prior election, to choose to retain those contributions and roll them forward to the next election up to the contribution limit so transferred. Such transferred funds are not matchable and do not apply to meeting qualification thresholds.
All right, I'm sorry, abstention.
Abstain, okay. Okay.
So one abstention, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in favor, and then is it 1, 2, 3 noes, just for the record. What,
I'm sorry? Okay, so what is
Let's
it?
keep
what-
going.
Yeah, let's keep going. Are we going to be doing a short break for lunch? Are we going to?
yes, I don't know at what time.
I recommend we go through the next proposal.
Okay,
Wait, quick question.
Yeah.
I apologize.
yeah.
So it does not have to be a competitive race, right? And it does not have to,
If it's not a competitive race, and you've raised money, and you have that money, and you're not going to get matchable funds because it's not a competitive race, this motion would have allowed you to retain those funds and bring them forward to the next election cycle when you may have a competitive race. But if you didn't, you could roll them forward again to another competitive
so I would
race.
like to
All right,
amend my vote and vote yes.
okay, yes.
You see, that made a huge
Yeah,
difference.
that's fair, okay. Yeah, and again, remember, it's not matchable when you roll it forward, and it doesn't apply to the threshold. Okay, so we got, okay, so you
Thank
got
you.
that? Great. So now, 2 would be to amend thresholds for participation in the program. So we had gotten a number of comments from the Brennan Center and other groups, Campaign Campaign Finance Institute, as well as, there's been certain discussions back and forth. We had come up with a qualification in the gubernatorial to at 600,000 with 6,000 contributors to make threshold, and I'm recommending to go, and the Brennan Center and others had been asking for 400,000 and 4,000 contributors, so I had looked at it. I don't think there's that much of a move. I think that the 600,000 is a good number, but I would say, as we're going to look at the state Senate and state Assembly, and I'll get to that next, that moving it down to 500,000 and 5,000 contributors would be something that I think, I, for one, be comfortable with, and I'm making that proposal as we move forward and take a look next at what we're going to do with the Assembly and the Senate. Okay?
Second.
Okay.
There's discussion.
Discussion?
The only point I would make is I think that's a compromise, and we have to try to reach a middle ground somehow. I was more sympathetic with Denora's proposal of 400,000 and 4,000, but and of course, we want to move away from 600,000 and 6,000, so I'm looking at 5,000 and 500,000 as a compromise, because I think we got to try to reach a middle ground on some of these issues
Okay.
where we have some disagreement.
That's what we're trying. Okay?
Did you hear what John said?
I heard, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Can we move it along?
Does anybody else want to comment? I'll just say I appreciate Commissioner Nona's comment. She's agreed.
Me
So
too.
Does anybody have a middle ground?
That is the middle
That is the
ground.
middle ground.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay. All in favor?
So, was it seconded?
Yeah.
Yes, so all in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed?
No.
One. One opposed.
Oh, I almost counted you as an aye.
They-
I speak strategically.
Okay, then motion 4 would be, and remember, we will be proposing an AMI later, and we can move the, I think it probably makes sense to move the AMI discussion up after this, because it probably goes along with it.
I mean, timing-wise, just so we're
Yeah.
all on the same page, is I think we're going to break at 1, which is in 15 minutes for, 30 minutes or so, 40 minutes, so.
So let's see where we get with this
Right, I
threshold
just,
issue, yeah.
as you're talking about
Okay.
pairing them, I
Yeah.
just wanted you all to be aware of that.
Yeah, I'm just saying that it should be the next, because.
I agree.
Right. Okay, so what I'm recommending is this. We have, I've read the material at some length, and I have a different viewpoint that I'll present, as usual. But, But I am asking that we move to reduce the threshold for qualification for participation in races for the state Senate, which is currently at 18,000 with 150 contributors, to 12,000 with 150 contributors. The Assembly would change from $7,500 with 75 contributors to 6,000 with 75 contributors, which brings it down substantially. And what I point out is that, and I'll just mention that the AMI that will be recommended would take for districts in the lower half of average median income, those districts in the Senate and Assembly, and would use, I believe it's, would go to a 2/3 threshold for those districts, bringing the Senate down to $9,000, same number of contributors.
Is that right? 8,000 is what I see
I'm
here.
sorry, 8,000, I'm sorry, 8,000, my apologies. And the Assembly would be reduced to 4,000, all right, from
From
6.
six.
From 6 for the lower income districts. And then there's a severability clause, so you know, that would make those amounts 10,000 for the Senate and 5,000 for the Assembly if the AMI did not apply. So there would be some fallback, and we wouldn't be stuck with just the higher amount. And that, I think, gets us a lot closer, though I still have, and I will voice this, my belief is that for many, many districts, this is a very easy threshold to make. When I look at districts, on Long Island in particular, in Westchester, and other places in some areas of Manhattan, Queens, and the like, that are higher income, you're looking at $6,000. You're talking, or Assembly goes to $7,500. Forget the AMI adjustment. The Assembly goes to, I'm sorry, the $6,000. You're looking at Yeah, $6,000 with 75 contributors is the threshold change, am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
Here.
Okay.
Yes.
So 6,000,
The bold
if you
language.
just did, you know, find people, 250 people, 20 people gets you to 5,000 right away at $250. That's not an unattainable amount for a high-income district. That's what I'm saying, but we don't want to be too low, and yet we don't want to be too high, and I think that this kind of meets somewhere in the middle, particularly with the AMI adjustment.
So 12,000 with 150 is, if you just did the math, that's $80 would be their, if you only
Yes,
talked,
If you did-
right, and then,
No, it would be $80, yeah.
and 6,000 it's the same. It'll actually be 80.
I guess you're about right, yeah.
So you would have to find at least 80 people. Obviously, you can find more.
$80.
Right.
So can we start over and describe
Yeah,
this again
I
from the
think it was-
beginning, because it's,
Yeah.
I agree. It would be helpful.
Okay, let me start again. Forgetting what we did, because that just confuses everybody, right? I am proposing that the Senate threshold, all right, before an AMI, before we go to AMI, would be $12,000. You would need 150 contributors, okay? So,
At a minimum.
at a minimum. So if you took 12,000 and you divided that by 150, that would mean 150 people giving $80, or 300 people giving $40, all right? Et cetera. That's in a Senate district, which has,
so you'd have to have a minimum of 150 contributors.
that's right, 150
And
contributors.
meet $12,000.
That's right.
Okay.
The number of contributors we haven't changed.
That we haven't
We've been talking
changed.
about those numbers,
Everybody
those
has been
ranges.
comfortable with that.
Lowering the number.
We're lowering the
Yeah.
bulk threshold number.
Okay.
The assembly would go to $6,000 with 75 contributors. And again, I think that you're right, that comes to $80 apiece. Yeah, right, $80 apiece. Then later, so you understand, we have districts that are not as wealthy, that are below the average median income, which in the state of New York, I believe, to be $62,700 some odd dollars, I think. And so what would happen there is we would go to a 2/3 factor, so the Senate would go from 12 to 8, the Assembly would go from 6 down to 4. And so that's how that is taken into account. And then when we get,
But,
yeah,
Jay, just so I'm clear, but it would still be the same number
the
of,
same number of people. People doesn't change.
it's
But we
just,
still have to vote on the AMI.
yes, we have
That's
to
right.
vote on all of
You
it.
have to vote on all of it, right.
But it would be, and do you know how many districts would be impacted by the AMI?
Good question.
I do, and there are a lot. I have that, I may not have that right here, but I can get you that.
Because I would like to just
Don't
know
look at
that.
them, Henry. You'll get them in trouble.
Well,
Oh.
it'd be about half,
He's-
right? Half below and half above. That's right. It's
So
half
it's about half for,
Right, se-
wait,
75
hold on,
above and 75 below.
wait, let me ask them. Half from, for Senate and Assembly?
Yes, that's the way you define it. Average.
Food is here, makes any
I've been concerned about the thresholds, and I was concerned about where they are. I think this is a significant move. My concern is that, in my view, it only works as part of a package with the AMI. If we were voting on this separately, I would vote no. If we vote on this with the AMI package, I would vote yes.
I agree.
That's, no,
No, go ahead.
no, you have the
No,
mic.
no, no, you have it. I think you'll say it much more eloquently than I will.
It's a great compliment at this time of the day and before hangry sets in. I'm just going to say I agree with Jay, and my proposal was to have the limits be lower, so I would like to have those votes be taken together, because I would push for us to have lower thresholds if the AMI isn't in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, my approach was consistent with what was proposed by Denora and the Brennan Center, which was 9,600 for the Senate and 4,000 for the Assembly. When you bake in the AMI proposal, that brings, for those districts, closer to what I think reasonable thresholds are. So I think the AMI proposal is pretty critical to this combination, this bifurcated threshold level. However, we do need to have some alternative in case the AMI proposal.
Well, it's
is-
included in the proposal here. It's in the proposal,
Proposal 5.
right. So it makes clear that if if it's
Oh,
a,
motion 5, okay, you're right, I've seen that, right.
it makes clear that if this is severed from the AMI proposal is severed, that it would come down to 5,000 for Senate, 5,000 for Assembly and 10,000 for Senate.
And that's okay, that's pretty close. So,
Right.
yeah, I'm fine with that.
So can I amend can I just borrow this for a second, please? Yes. Let me amend the motion then, to move to reduce the threshold, let me do this. Move to set the threshold for qualification, for participation in races for the state Senate to $12,000 with 150 contributors. Assembly would be set at $6,000 with 75 contributors. And we would adopt a simple AMI per district adjustment to the thresholds for qualifications for state Senate and state Assembly, which provides no adjustment for districts above the average median income, and it adjusts all districts below the average median income to 66.67% of the base threshold, such that the Senate threshold for below AMI districts would be reduced from $12,000 to $8,000, and for Assembly, the threshold for below average median income districts would be reduced from $6,000 to $4,000. The severability clause related to the AMI per district threshold adjustments should provide that if struck down by the courts, that the Assembly threshold will default to $5,000 and the Senate threshold shall default to $10,000.
For all districts.
For all districts. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay. Any discussion? Okay. All right. You want to move it?
Is there just discussion before there is a second?
I just want to state that I'm confused, not shocking. I think when we all came up with these numbers, if we go back, we had an out-of-district match, then we took the out-of-district match off, and we had differing contribution limits for participation and non-participation, and now there's the same. And now we're lowering the thresholds when, in essence, you'd be crazy not to participate with the same contribution limits, which leads me to believe, I'm confused. I understand everything, I'm just a no.
Okay.
So we're going to take a vote?
Yeah,
You
take a vote.
have a comment, maybe?
Okay.
So
So are you voting?
Yeah.
Does anybody want to discuss further, or? I take that as we're voting.
Kimberly
We-
voted no.
Yeah, we just go down that way.
Can we call the question again? Can we call what we're voting on again
I'd
before we
like
go?
the default.
Well, one more time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll read it one more time. Move to set the threshold for qualification for participation in races for the state Senate at $12,000 with 150 contributors. Assembly would be set at $6,000 with 75 contributors. And that we adopt a simple AMI per district adjustment to the thresholds for qualification for state Senate and state Assembly, which provides no adjustments for districts above the average median income, and adjusts all districts below the average median income to 66.67% of the base threshold, such that the Senate threshold for below AMI districts would be reduced from $12,000 to $8,000. And for the Assembly, the threshold for below AMI districts would be reduced from $6,000 to $4,000. The severability clause related to the AMI per district threshold adjustments should provide that if struck down by the courts, that the Assembly threshold will default to $5,000 and the Senate threshold shall default to $10,000 for all districts. Can we vote? Yeah.
I'm a no, but I'm reserving my right during our break to look at it again and try to more fully understand exactly what we're voting on.
If you want to just wait.
Yeah, no,
Let's vote.
Yeah, I'm a no. I think the underpinnings of so many of the reasons that have been stated in prior conversations have been completely diluted or transformed. That I'm just, there's too many to raise. I'll just be a no.
I think this encourages participation, and I think, again, it's a fair compromise for differing positions that members of the commission have had, so I vote aye.
Aye.
I'm an aye, especially with the caveat that if the courts don't uphold this, that there is a default set in place. And I think that it's okay to try to do different things to address our diverse state.
I think everything's been said, but not by everybody, but I'll just vote aye.
Well, I'm the everybody who's just going to reiterate that I appreciate the compromise here. This is much closer to the recommendations that I had around lowering the limits to ensure and incentivize participation by all candidates, and I appreciate that if this clause is stricken, that it's even closer to the number that I recommended. So in the spirit of compromise, I'm excited to vote aye.
I vote aye.
Okay, final question. Make sure my math is right. So with the AMI, that's what I was trying to do, it will be 8,000 for the Senate and 4,000 for the Assembly, which is almost like $50 each, right, to reach that? If I'm correct, then my answer is aye.
I'm just going to do that.
Yes,
Yes.
please.
Fine. It's more than that,
52 or 53, something
Right.
like that.
a little more.
A little over.
A little
Little over.
Yeah, a little over.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so then, yes, aye.
Aye, okay. So you've got, it's 7 to 2 in favor. Those motions pass.
Yeah.
So it's motion 4 and 8 are combined. We can break for a little lunch.
Is one other item that we can't let slip through the cracks. We did not actually vote on the other statewide races, which we haven't changed. I don't think anybody has come up with a different recommendation, but for lieutenant governor, attorney general, and controller, we had 1,000 donor, number of donors, 1,000, minimum amount, 100,000 to be raised as a threshold. So
And that hasn't changed.
we haven't changed that. Just want to make sure that's still part of the
Confirming.
proposal.
Right, that is fine. Okay,
Yep.
break for a short lunch, grab lunch.
All right, let's take a break and
Not more than a half hour.
resume at 1.
What time is it now? 1:40.